The Paddy Power Half Hour on Off the Ball.
With Paddy Power, the greatest football partnership since Shearer and Owen.
You're very welcome along to the Paddy Power Half Hour, streamed live across all the Off the Ball social channels every Friday at around about 12 o'clock. I'm joined on the line by O'Callaghan and Ciaran Bradley as we look at some of the best football stories from throughout the week. But we're going to start with a story that we follow in OTB-AM. Ray Moylett completed 1,000 push-ups just over an hour. He didn't get that 1,000 in the hour, but he did complete the 1,000. It was probably 1 hour and 1 minute that he completed. Raised a ton of money for Paddy House and the NHS frontline staff. So we want to pass on our congratulations, first of all, to Ray Moylett. Second of all, Ciaran Bradley, how many push-ups do you think you could do in an hour?
Oh, easily 15. Easily, no question. It'd be grand doing that. But no, I was watching it online there with Ray, and he was doing some incredible work towards the end. I was just like, you poor man. There was absolutely nothing left in the tank. He was just doing that weird kind of wriggle, like the full worm. But it was great.
Well, O'Callaghan, were you following it?
Yeah, fantastic effort by Ray, and perhaps, more importantly, I like the fact that he finished the 1,000 out as well. He could easily have just dropped the arms when the stopwatch finished and went, right, I'm not going to push through the last 8 or 9 I think he had to complete. But he got there, got the 1,000 done just after the hour. I'm sure we'll forgive the stop clock on that one. And it was the fact that the money was raising at just about the right amount as he went along as well. So going into the last few minutes, he was on, I think, 9,200. I was just keeping an eye on the ticker at that stage, and then flicked the GoFundMe seconds after he finished, and he'd gone over the 10,000. And I think when he was chatting to Adrian and to Owen just after the competition a few minutes ago, he'd already reached €10,500. So a remarkable effort. Obviously, Paddy House and the HSE frontline workers are the big winners in this one, more important than the challenge itself. But fair play to Ray. It means he's done, 2,000 press-ups in a 1 hour period twice in the last month, which is very impressive indeed.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant.
He was also... he was also, I think he's now on Mayo's Mount Rushmore officially, because Jared promised that they'd carve out Kev's face and replace him with Ray. So there you go, that's the real prize.
Well, it's a fairly handy one as well, because after the penalty against Spain, I don't think it would have taken much to kick Kev off that Mount Rushmore of Mayo. But we are going to talk a little bit about football this week. We're going to start with some terribly sad news this morning. Former Leeds player Norman Hunter has passed away after coming down with COVID-19 coronavirus during the week. Very sad news, Will O'Callaghan.
Yeah, and I was just listening to Johnny Giles speaking to Nathan on Off the Ball last night, and I think he made a very nice tribute to his friend. Said, look, they probably don't meet up as often as they should, but whenever they do, it feels like they haven't been away from each other for a long time. I mean, a bit like Johnny, Hunter lived through the most important period in Leeds history, probably 700 games across the most glorious period, going up from Division 2 into the old English top division, winning a couple of league titles, getting to a European final, being part of the squad in 1966 as well. Probably known as one of those kind of very industrious, hard-working players throughout that period as well, and key to Leeds' success. There's Leeds have named things after him in the time since as well. So we're talking about a real bona fide legend. So a very sad day for all who are involved with Elland Road, and perhaps timely that we heard Johnny talking about Norman with such warmth last night in the show.
Yeah, and I think one of the stark things that he said was about how down to earth Norman was, that he never got ahead of himself. He always passed the credit on to someone else if somebody gave him a compliment, and it was a really glowing tribute to a friend of his. And the thing that stuck with me as well, like what Will is saying, Ciaran, is just the fact that he said that they didn't meet up as much as they probably should have, and that's maybe a lesson that we're all learning as we can't meet up with our loved ones during this pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it was really touching. I was working last night, listening to John, and John's spoken before about a particular feeling of a kind of band of brothers that he had with that Revie Leeds team, and I think it's really poignant as time passes and people from that side kind of pass away, that you look back and you're just like, it really does bring that home to you, that the thing that really is important when something like this happens is friends and family. And it was a really touching tribute from John last night. It really got to me. I was messaging a friend of mine actually as I was listening to it, and I would recommend everyone to go back and listen to that as well, because it was really lovely.
Yeah, it was absolutely brilliant, and Norman Hunter will definitely be remembered by many more at Ellen Road and elsewhere as well. May he rest in peace. We're going to move on to some other news from throughout the week. It's actually been quite a busy week in terms of football news. We're going to have a bit more on this story later on when the Premier League clubs eventually do meet, but they are due to meet today to discuss how they're going to end the season. This seems to be an ongoing conversation that we're all kind of sick of. It's the VAR conversation of the pandemic now that we don't actually have football. But something has to be done, something has to be decided, and the Premier League clubs are going to meet today. Apparently, there is going to be civil war. That is what has been reported in several newspapers across England and in Ireland as well, that the Premier League clubs aren't going to see eye to eye. Will O'Callaghan, can you fill us in on what's going to happen today? Is there any idea of how they're going to actually finish this?
Yeah, I guess what's really been floated at the moment, and perhaps the biggest proposal that's going to be on for today for the clubs to actually discuss, and perhaps the most radical of all, will be that they could determine that the season has to be completed by June the 30th. That's come what may, whether fixtures get completed on the pitch or not, that they're going to draw a line at June the 30th. Apparently, according to quite a few of the reports, I was just reading the Guardian report before we came on, they just put kind of an update in terms of what's likely to happen this afternoon. 14 clubs would need to vote in favour of any particular proposal that will be put forward at that meeting this afternoon. And it seems very unlikely that that radical choice of June the 30th is unlikely to get passed by the 14 clubs. There is some support among some clubs, but not believed to be enough to carry it with just 6 clubs voting against. So that seems fairly unlikely to happen, particularly when you take into account as well, Enda, that the German clubs have returned to training. Bayern Munich won the first back this week just gone by. They're hoping to get the Bundesliga back up and running by kind of the middle to late June. There is no sign that Premier League teams will be going back to any kind of collective training at this point when you take the British guidelines into account before the end of May. So for me, June the 30th seems absolutely impossible. It's definitely going to run longer into the summer than that. The other proposals which they can look at are potentially making changes to next season, which seems very realistic that that's going to have to be considered, so that potentially switches would have to be made to 2021 in order to allow the 1920 season to be able to be completed. And everything is pretty much up for discussion on that, potentially dropping some of the cup competitions, maybe curtailing some of the breaks. I would imagine the winter break for next season will most likely fall. And all this, of course, falls into the context as well of FIFA having to work out the international windows. We spoke about this last week in terms of Stephen Kenny. You would imagine they have to fit somewhere into the calendar for the rest of 2020 as well. And that's all wondering what's going to happen in terms of games behind closed doors, COVID-19 testing, a lot of it up in the air, but maybe we'll get somewhat of a roadmap, at least in terms of what the clubs want to do by later on this evening.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the key issues here is the players' contracts, because it would be all well and good to organise this for next season and change next season's plans, but the players who are out of contract, legally they're on good ground when it comes to negotiating with other clubs or even leaving that club. So that's where the complications start to come in for the Premier League especially. But earlier on this week we did see some changes in the SPFL. The clubs voted marginally to end the season early. That's probably not a road that the Premier League are going to go down, especially now that they see the reaction from different clubs like Rangers. Ciaran Bradley, have you been following that story?
It has been the most confusing story. Like the Dundee stuff alone is exceptionally difficult to follow. And the SPFL, I mean, you can say what you like from kind of Rangers' point of view, but they don't seem to have covered themselves especially in glory in terms of the urgency around this vote, because obviously with the lower league clubs particularly, there's a particular issue around cash flow. And they said initially that they had 28 days to submit their votes around this issue. And then there was confusion over whether they had to do that by Friday of last week. Rangers have obviously reacted up in arms about this. I think just to kind of tie the 2 points together, it does seem interesting that initially around this issue, there seemed to be some unity among the clubs, particularly in the Premier League, when they were talking about the proposals and what could happen, because they realised that these were exceptional circumstances and that exceptional action needed to be taken. And as the weeks have passed, it seems that kind of feeling of fraternity has somewhat ebbed away. So it'll be very interesting, and we obviously touched upon the German league issue there as well, and I think a lot of people in the footballing world are looking to Germany as a kind of a potential way of moving forward with the season. But you have to realise that Germany's actually almost like a particular outlier when it comes to this coronavirus. They have had among the lowest death rates in the world, so it's something that seems like a little bit more of a prospect for them at the moment. So I just, from a fan's point of view, I hope that clubs are able to put the kind of bickering aside and look at practicable options that will come to pass. I think one that I heard that sounded quite interesting was the idea of almost stretching this season over 2 seasons. Now, obviously, that depends on the coronavirus continuing on the road that we think it will, that will go for a good bit longer, and then basically it allows teams and clubs the ability to train for longer periods and kind of incorporate the summer break into one, and basically finish this season by, say, end of this year and at the start of next year. So from my point of view as a football fan, I just hope we're in a position to look at some options and kind of put the bickering to one side.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to know what's going to happen in that meeting later on, but we will find out, and it'll be covered across offtheball.com when we do have news of what's going to happen with the Premier League and the future and what comes out of that meeting. Sticking with the SPFL for just the time being, Rangers have called this vote. They basically came out with a statement over the last couple of days saying no fair-minded person can take this outcome of the vote seriously. The SPFL have conducted a process which has been misleading and deeply flawed. When you compare their reaction to the likes of Patrick Thistle, who have been relegated to League One, it seems to be a little bit of an overreaction from Rangers. But I just want to focus on the football side of things, because obviously Celtic will be granted their 9th title in a row now, one more closer to the 10 in a row. They were probably going to win this anyway, Will O'Callaghan. Do you think this is almost... I know Steven Gerrard came out with a statement in anger during the week about the decision, but do you think this is almost Steven Gerrard getting off the hook a little bit this year, because he can say that, you know, the season was ended early, he wanted to be against that, he was against that decision from the start, and that the next season will give him a bit more leeway?
I don't think any rational person would argue, Enda, that Celtic didn't have the Scottish Premiership title absolutely wrapped up. It was just a case of when rather than if they were going to win the title. They were on that remarkable run after they lost to Rangers at Christmas time, and since then Celtic have just been pulling away further and further from Rangers. What surprised me, to be honest, last Saturday really was not that it was Rangers who were putting in the argument to the SPFL and calling for heads on Saturday evening. It was that Hearts weren't the club who were making the complaints, because Hearts were the team who were due to be relegated and who would be most heavily impacted by this. I mean, it seems interesting. Obviously, somebody tipped Rangers off about the Dundee vote, and there was some confusion about that from the Friday. Dundee were certainly the club who were being blamed, despite the fact that they had said they had their vote in on time. And definitely, you know, that's quite interesting. And Rangers did not back down either when the SPFL kind of fired back very quickly and said, hey, show me the evidence of this supposed wrongdoing or withdraw your allegations straight away. And Rangers have stayed, you know, pretty strong throughout the week about this as well. Obviously, look, it plays to a certain extent that they're making sure that Celtic aren't handed that 9 in a row, but I'm not sure really that anyone would grant Steven Gerrard any particular leeway about what's happened this season if Celtic were to win it without the final games of the season being completed, and if it was determined the Scottish Premiership is going to be decided on what's effectively cricket's Duckworth-Lewis method, by working out what would have been their average points over the period. It seems a very strange way to finish the season, but you get the feeling that in Scotland that is definitely the way they're going now.
Yeah, and one way to look at this is the financial issue with this as well, because it's not cheap to bring the likes of the SPFL to court over this, because that's one of the reasons that Partick Thistle, like I mentioned them, they chose not to pursue this legally because their lawyers said that it would be too costly, and the fact that they're going to be relegated into League One, that's going to be a big enough financial damage to the club that they can't actually afford to take the SPFL to court over this. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops for Rangers, and over the next few weeks see what actually happens with the SPFL. It is a basket case of a league at times, and has proven that even in the midst of a pandemic. A little bit of a trivial story now. Graham Souness, Paul Pogba. The rivalry continues. Even when there's not football, they find a way to get at each other. Paul Pogba did an Instagram live. He was asked about the criticism that Graham Souness has given him over the last couple of weeks or last couple of years when he was playing for Manchester United. And he said that he hadn't even heard of Graham Souness before he came to the Premier League. Do you buy that, Will?
I don't. I think there's no way that Paul Pogba, given how often Graham Souness has sniped at him over the last couple of years in particular, that Paul Pogba would not be aware, at least on some level, if he flicks on Sky Sports News or watches back a game or watches Monday Night Football when he's not playing, that he wouldn't have heard something that Graham Souness would have said on Super Sunday about him at some point. I find it hard to believe that footballers wouldn't be aware of that, because I think everyone is usually fairly much keeping up with what's being said about them along the way. So I think it was a deliberate throw of shade by Paul Pogba. I mean, in fairness to Pogba, like, it seems entirely appropriate that we're talking about him when there's no football on, because Paul Pogba has played so little football this season and is probably still one of the most talked about players in the Premier League. I do get the feeling, and I think Tony Evans has an interesting article this morning in The Independent about this, that Graham Souness' constant talking about Paul Pogba might come from a different place to what many people feel, and that's that maybe Graham Souness just feels that Paul Pogba is not living up to the potential that he could live up to. Because Evans drew a very interesting parallel that, Souness was known in the Liverpool dressing room when he was a young player for being a champagne Charlie. He went out on the beer all the time. Paisley indulged the players going out. But there was this feeling that whenever they got back to training in Liverpool and whenever matches came round, there was a certain work rate that was expected. And there was 3 different generals there, all Scots, in Hansen, Dalglish and in Souness. And if anyone dropped below the required standard, those players would let you know about it. And it's almost like Souness is saying, look, I see all this potential Paul Pogba has. I've seen how he's played at Juventus. I've seen how he's played in the World Cup. I don't see those efforts of application happening at Manchester United. And instead of it seeming that he has some kind of weird obsession with Paul Pogba, it might just be that Graham Souness sees what Paul Pogba could potentially be.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not as if Graham Souness is talking about Paul Pogba unless he's asked about him. It's generally at a Manchester United game, and Paul Pogba's performances haven't been up to scratch this year at all when he has played. And in the last couple of years, he hasn't been living up to that potential that we, as football fans and football pundits, know that he has a real talent there, but he just hasn't been doing it. Ciaran Bradley, where do you stand on Paul Pogba, his Manchester United career? Do you think he's living up to the potential?
No, it isn't. And to be honest, I was quite happy to see that Tony Evans article around Souness this morning, because I think the danger of fans and commentators looking at that Souness-Pogba dynamic think that Souness is kind of just ranting and raving at anyone who'll listen about Pogba. He's being asked about him, and he's saying, from a position of a 3-time European Cup winner, I see the talent this young man has, and he is not fulfilling it. And you can see that as a Manchester United fan on the pitch. Like, there are games when he turns it on, and there are games when he doesn't. And the games when he doesn't, he's a passenger, and it's the reason that there's such a contrast between him and the emergence of Bruno Fernandes at the moment. And I imagine that's probably rubbing him up the wrong way. It's interesting, actually, because it called to mind something that Sid Lowe said a few years ago about Cristiano Ronaldo, when he was talking about Ronaldo and saying he's become this kind of figure of fun because he's this single-minded, kind of maniac when it comes to success. But that's something that we should all aspire to. That kind of single-mindedness and that wringing every sort of bit out of your talent should be everything that we should be doing across all manners of whatever jobs you're doing. So when you see someone like Pogba, who's been given these supreme skills or indeed developed them through the course of his youth career, to, in my mind, be squandering them at the peak times of his career is incredibly frustrating as a fan, and I can only imagine it is to Souness as well.
Well, initially, I actually did think that a bit too much was made about his dancing and his Twitter and his Instagram and all that there. But then the further on that he went and the less and less he started to play and the worse he started to play, the more I did actually buy into that distraction idea that he just isn't, he's not focused enough on football. He needs to actually get his head down and start working. And to be fair, I actually do think that that's where Graham Souness is coming from. I don't think it's coming from anywhere else. I think I would be inclined to agree with both of you. It does seem like he just wants this kid to actually fulfill the talent that he has, and he just hasn't been doing that so far. And Bruno Fernandes, as you mentioned, he has been speaking and he's been saying that you'll see a different Paul Pogba next season or whenever football continues. And it'll be interesting to see if those two can strike up a partnership when football does eventually come back. Where are United at the minute in terms of developing further? They were in a great run of form before football stopped. Do you think if football does continue that they can... First of all, do you think Paul Pogba will stay at United, and is that a good thing for United going forward?
I guess the answer...
I don't think so. Sorry.
No, sorry, Ciaran. Go on. No, go on, Ciaran.
No, I don't think that he'll be there next season. I don't think he'll go for an astronomical fee, but I think actually Solskjaer has been pretty ruthless in his recruitment, and i.e. in the people that he's got rid of. I think that getting rid of him last summer would have been pretty disastrous given how thin the squad was at that stage. Obviously, they've added Fernandes since. But I think Solskjaer hasn't really been credited for the ruthlessness that he has shown in that recruitment, because he essentially said, look, no matter how short we're going to be, I'm going to get rid of the likes of Sanchez and Lukaku particularly, who are real potholes in that squad. And that's something that really bodes well, and it's one of the positives for Solskjaer and for United next season. I personally don't want to see Pogba there next season. I think he's just been something of a drain on the dressing room. And I think that it frees up, as we've seen with the likes of Ronaldo and Van Nistelrooy and the lights go, and once a big talismanic player like that leaves, others kind of rise to fill that hole.
And speaking of transfers and Manchester United transfers, Harry Kane was linked with Manchester United last week. He was linked with Juventus a few days later. It seems to be that he's a little bit unrestless at Tottenham. He doesn't seem to be happy there, and by the looks of what's been reported, it's down to the Tottenham decision to furlough their staff. Now, Tottenham have reversed that decision, and that has they're going to be paying 80% for April and May, and then the club will reassess from then on. Harry Kane and Hugo Lloris were outlined as some of the reasons why they've reversed this, but it seems to be that fan backlash has played a big role in this. Will O'Callaghan, the tide is turning on Premier League clubs, and especially probably the idea that Premier League players should take a pay cut. I think it comes off the back of some players coming out and speaking out against what the British government have been telling them.
Yeah, look, I think some of the players were very clever last week, where we saw some come together, and this has been led really by people like Jordan Henderson, where effectively they came out and put millions of pounds into a pot to ensure that it would go directly to NHS workers. I think a lot of people can probably understand where Premier League players are now coming from. It seems strange that you'd be asked to put that money away if clubs are willing to do what, on the face of it, Liverpool and Tottenham before the U-turned were quite happy to do, which was to take government money in order to save their own profits by putting their non-playing staff onto furlough. And then I think for players, it's perfectly understandable for them to think, hey, I'm more than happy to give away some of my money. This could be 20, could be 30% if it happens. But I want to know exactly where that money is going if I'm going to be giving it up, because they're already paying multiple millions in tax each year already, which goes on to help fund the NHS in Britain. And I think it's a fair question for players to ask as well. What are the owners going to do? I mean, we saw Golden Sullivan at West Ham last week put in €30 million of their own capital in order to keep the staff going there, which I think should be applauded. Other clubs have not exactly done that. I think certainly, I wouldn't blame the clubs here, but I think John Henry and the Fenway Group would definitely have gone ahead with their plans originally if it hadn't been for the fan backlash as well. So I think the players have actually came across pretty well over the last week or so. They've shown that they're more than happy to dip their hand into their pocket. Obviously, the Arsenal situation is interesting, where they were being asked to defer wages and potentially get it back if they got into the Champions League next year. Their players are probably wise enough to know they're not going to be in the Champions League, so therefore that doesn't seem like a particularly fair deal. So there's obviously been a lot going on here. You know, pressure has been ramped up, but when you see, you know, politicians not being particularly quick to take pay cuts themselves, you can understand why the players have maybe been slow to do so as well.
Yeah, definitely. And the Arsenal situation is really interesting because Arteta seems to be playing a key role in the players' decisions. I think he went and spoke to the players about potential wage deferrals over the last couple of weeks. So Arsenal is going to be a story that's going to be developing over the next week or so. Ciaran Bradley, next season, do you think we'll see a bit more of a relationship between the football fans and the football players now that when the push came to shove, the players stood up, they did their bit for the NHS, they stood up to the British government when they were being pushed to take wage cuts, and they even stood up to some of the club's owners, which I think will bring them some very good, bring a bit more of a relationship with the fans. They'll bring them closer to them.
Yeah, in one sense, I think so, because I think that there has been a danger over the years for fans and commentators in general to kind of view football players as sort of quite unintelligent or not, or kind of, as we talked about earlier, these champagne Charlies, etc. And I think that's actually very reductive and largely unfair. I mean, if you look and listen to a lot of the higher profile players, the likes of Jordan Henderson, for example, they're very interesting, very socially minded people, because for the most part, a lot of these players would have come from fairly poor parts of the UK. You know, the likes of Raheem Sterling, for example, or Jordan Henderson, many others. They're very wary of where they come from, and what clubs are actually very good at is putting back into their community. I mean, even if you look at Tottenham, I know they've come in for a lot of criticism, but they do a lot of work within their community, particularly since the stadium has been built. So I think it might be a little bit wishful thinking that it kind of builds this utopian sort of relationship between fans and players. But for the most part, I think what this coronavirus pandemic should do is just make us reevaluate what is important, and that's happened for players, and hopefully fans will do that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's about all we have time for here on the Paddy Power Half Hour. If you want to listen back to that show, go to offtheball.com/podcast. It'll be up in about a half an hour. So if you want to look back at Ray Moylett's 1,000 push-ups in an hour, you can find that on our YouTube channel, and you can find his GoFundMe link on the Off the Ball Twitter as well. He was raising funds for the HSE and Pieta House, and I think he was just over 10,500 last time I looked at it. He might be over the 11,000 mark now. So if you want to donate to that, it's for two very worthy causes. Will O'Callaghan, Ciaran Bradley, thanks very much for joining us. Our football coverage here in Off the Ball is brought to you in association with Paddy Power. For more information for responsible gambling, visit dunlewy.net.
The Paddy Power Half Hour on Off the Ball.
With Paddy Power, the greatest football partnership since Jeff and Heskey.